So last June, Marley and I embarked on what is called a ghost town tour. It was a bus tour leaving from Lethbridge, Alberta, into the interior of British Columbia to see places where Japanese Canadians were interned during the Second World War. And this tour was organized by the Nikkei Cultural Society of Lethbridge and area. It was open to all who were interested from across the country. There were 37 of us on the trip, about half from Japanese Canadian backgrounds, and many with connections to United Churches in Lethbridge and Calgary, and to our leaders. And our leaders here, they're Pastor George Takashima, retired United Church minister from Lethbridge, and his wife Peggy. I left some copies of background information that they prepared for us relating to this tour, and it's on the table in the narthex, and I can email you the information as well if you'd like to have that. By the way, during this talk I'm going to use sometimes different terms, abbreviations. Sometimes I use the abbreviation CJ, meaning Canadians of Japanese descent, rather than saying that every time, or Japanese Canadians. Now our trip was to take us to Nelson, BC. This microphone is a bit off because maybe I'll use mostly the one on the pulpit, Paul. So we go to Nelson, BC, and then sort of use it as a home base, and then up in a circle known to tourists as the Silvery Slocan Circle Route, through towns like Slocan, New Denver, and Kaslo. And we circle Kokanee Glacier Park and travel along the shores of the Slocan and Kootenay lakes. But to make this tour make sense, I have to step back, way back to the early 1900s, to trace how my family ended up in this area. My maternal grandfather, Yuhei Matsugu, was a boat builder and a carpenter. When they first came to Canada, he and his wife Kunie, they lived in Alert Bay on Vancouver Island. But as children were born to them, they decided to move to Vancouver, and they bought a house in the eastern part of the city that was called Japantown. Now, since the turn of the century, this area had been developing into the hub of the Japanese Canadian community. Now, with the exception of the anti-Asian riots in 1907, which followed a rally of the Asiatic Exclusion League, the community was left to develop in relative peace. Although anti-Asian sentiments and politics were common, and CJs were treated as second-class citizens, being denied the right to vote and barred from most professions and civil service. In Japantown, businesses flourished and a Japanese language school was established. And the Methodist Church ran missions there, and many Japanese Canadians converted to Christianity, my grandparents among them. Here's a picture of Powell Street United Church, where my mother's family attended. My father's family, on the other hand, they settled in New Westminster. At that time, it would be considered a suburb of Vancouver. My grandfather, Yusuke Kai, was a cobbler, making and repairing shoes as his trade. My grandmother, Tammy Kai, was at home, raising a family of what would eventually be 11 children. My father, Isamu Sam, was the oldest, being born in 1919. They were able to purchase this modest house, which still stands on 11th Street. And they attended Japanese language services at New Westminster United Church. And with the outbreak of war between Canada and Japan, restrictions were placed on Japanese Canadians using the power of the War Measures Act. A curfew was imposed on them from dusk to dawn. Cameras, radios, and firearms were confiscated, as were cars, fishing boats, and eventually houses, all turned over to the BC Securities Commission. A protected area was established from the BC coast to 100 miles inland, and all Japanese Canadians in that area, about 15,000 people, were to be moved out. Here's a copy. It's a bit hard to see, but a copy of a letter my father received telling that in 2 days he was to report to be shipped off to a work camp outside of the protected zone. My father was sent to a work camp near Scriber, Ontario, where his crew was set to work on building the Trans-Canada Highway. Now, in preparation for the move, JCs or CJs living outside Vancouver were brought to Hastings Park. They were housed in buildings that were designed for the Pacific National Exhibition, the PNE. So the men's dorm was here in this arena. And the family quarters were in the very unsanitary conditions of the livestock barns. In all these actions, no distinction was ever made between those who still held Japanese citizenship, about a quarter of the population, or those who were naturalized Canadians, or who were born in Canada. There's even no exemption made for Japanese Canadian veterans who fought for Canada during the First World War. And by the way, British Columbia would not accept CJs into the armed forces for the First World War, so these soldiers first had to travel to Alberta or farther east in order to enlist. Of the approximately 22,000 CJs living in BC before the war, over 12,000 ended up in the internment camps. It's widely acknowledged that racism fueled by wartime hysteria and stirred up by anti-Asian BC politicians led to all Japanese Canadians being regarded as enemy aliens, even though the RCMP had advised the government that the Japanese Canadians did not present a threat to national security. But racist BC politicians used the war as a means to rid themselves of what they considered to be a social and economic problem. And so the Kai and Matsugu families prepared for the move to the interior of BC. Basically, they were allowed to take only whatever they could carry themselves. People left most of their possessions in their homes, for one, because they couldn't carry them, and secondly, because they were assured that they would be returning to those homes after the war. Through all of this, the community chose to cooperate with the authorities. And in fact, there was not much choice. The few that did dare to resist were quickly taken away to prisoner of war camps. So the people who lived in the camps that we were going to see on the tour were shipped out by train from Vancouver to Nelson, and from there they were taken to the camps by truck. Or in the case of those in Kaslo, they were put on the paddle wheel steamers and to travel via Kootenay Lake. Now here I should qualify some of the terms that I'm using today. The ghost towns like New Denver and Kaslo were mining towns that had once prospered but had become abandoned when their supplies of accessible ore ran out. However, many of the places where Japanese Canadians were interned were not ghost towns. Often they were hastily constructed camps and, in at least in one case, a tent city. So perhaps it's better to refer to these places as internment camps, even shanty towns. Often uncured lumber was used to build the cabins, made very much in haste, which soon resulted in a lot of extra ventilation between the warping boards. And so tar paper was placed on the outside to keep out the wind, if not the cold. The names of these camps sometimes came from the farmers whose land was being leased, other times from the names of commanding officers, as in the case of Tashmi, which is in this picture. The camp at our first stop was named after the nearby Lemon Creek. This is a picture of how Lemon Creek looked in the early 1940s. This is what it looks like today. And that's what all that remains. There's now only a historic plaque and a memorial bench. This is a picture of Tom Tabe and Tom Tenemura of our tour group, who both lived in Lemon Creek some 70 years ago. And they hadn't seen each other since, but somehow they still recognized each other when they met at the start of the tour. Our next stop was the site of the Popoff camp, which was named after the farmer whose land it occupied. And the camp it's actually a bit accessible. It's behind the trees and across the river, so we couldn't get to it directly. And again, nothing remains of the camp, but there's a friendly farming family across the street, and they keep this historic poster on hand. And here's another picture of the camp when it was active. Now, Popoff is the camp where my uncles, or one of my uncles and his family were interned at first. This is my uncle, Masayoshi Arima, although his friends and we always called him Uncle Mush. A lot of people had nicknames like that. And he's married to my father's youngest sister. Now, this photo is old. It's from the 70s. You can probably tell that because there's a terrible shirt one of my other uncles is wearing behind in the background. It's actually a shirt. Now, when they had a terrible time, they were first living in Hastings Park, in the barns or the stables, but then they were sent to live in Slocan City. And there were not enough cabins ready, so a tent city was set up in Popoff until more permanent cabins were built. Here's pictures of such a tent, which is now in the museum in New Denver. So Uncle Mush, 12 years old at the time, moved into a tent with his mother and his 2 older sisters and older brother. Oops, the wrong way. And his father was not there. His father had been killed previously, 4 years before, in a sawmill accident. So they spent over a month in the tent that fall. But fortunately, they were able to move before winter into a cabin at Bay Farm that a family friend had built. Other people were not as fortunate and spent parts of the winter in the tents. Now, I'm going to use my Uncle Mush's own words to tell the next part of the story. He's written this. During that same time, my mom, who was having health problems, had to be hospitalized at the Slocan's clinic. But due to her condition, she was transferred to the New Denver sanatorium. When her condition worsened, we were summoned to New Denver. After a few days in the sanatorium, my mom passed away in August of 1944 at the age of 47, with 4 of us at her bedside. I think that with an accurate diagnosis and proper hospital care, she may have survived. The constant worrying about the family and turmoil caused by the evacuation may have contributed to her early death. Her funeral was held at the Buddhist church in Bay Farm. Our family and many friends gathered in front of the church for the arrival of my mom's body from New Denver. The shock of seeing a wooden box carrying my mother on the back of a pickup truck was a sad and heartbreaking moment in my life. Even at my age, I was 14 at the time, I somehow felt the indignity of that incident was not what my mother deserved. With the family now without parents, the difficult task of assuming the role as head of the family fell on my eldest sister, Takako, who was only 20 at the time. With our family now reduced to 4, our small cabin was partitioned in the middle of the house to accommodate another family. A young couple with a recently born baby moved into the other part of the cabin. The strangest thing is that I didn't know anything about this until just a few years ago, when at about the age of 80 years old, my uncle finally decided to share his story. This is fairly common with that generation, with the Nisei. If they do speak about the internment at all, it's only about the good experiences that they had. Here's one final picture from the Popoff site. On the right are 2 good friends of my Uncle Mush, and on the left is Mr. Teruo Higuchi, and he too was in Popoff as a child, but he was exiled to Japan after the war, where he remained to this day, but that's another whole story for another day. So our tour moved on through Sandon and a brief stop at the community hall there, then on to New Denver. And New Denver is a place called the Nikkei Internment Memorial Center, which has been set up by the community. And here there's 2 cabins from the internment years that have been preserved, and also a museum houses many displays and artifacts from the internment. It's inside of the cabins. And this is where many of the pictures that I'm using in this presentation are from. Now, there still are CJs living in New Denver, and they treated us to this delicious bento lunch, one of the highlights of the tour, I think. Now, if you're ever in this area of BC, this place certainly should be on your must-see list. So we stayed in New Denver that night, and the plan was to travel the next morning to Kaslo across Highway 31A. However, the torrential rains that eventually flooded parts of BC and Alberta, Calgary, High River, also caused mudslides and flooding across the road that we were supposed to take. And it was eventually decided that we would return to Nelson and take the long way to Kaslo. So here's some pictures of Kaslo. There's an old one as it was in Ghost Town days. Is that same street today? The view from the town. And Kaslo is a beautiful spot, and it would be a wonderful place to visit if you weren't being forced to live there and the house you owned wasn't hundreds of miles away. In Kaslo, the former Langham Hotel has now been transformed into a cultural center and a museum to remember those who were interned. Many families stayed at the Langham and Kaslo hotels during the internment. And my father's family, since it's so large, was found in an abandoned house to move into, which no longer stands. My mother's family was moved into the Kaslo Hotel, which has also not survived to the present day. For some 3 years, my mother, her younger sister, Lorraine, and their father and mother shared this a 9-by-12 room in the Kaslo Hotel, with the two girls sharing a bunk with a straw mattress on the top of their parents' bed, much like this room at the Langham, which has been restored to the way it was back then. There are 15 families on the floor. They're sharing 2 washrooms. They also had a single stove to prepare all their meals. My mother's younger brother stayed in a bunkhouse for boys. One older brother was sent to a road camp, while her oldest brother and family volunteered to do backbreaking work of sugar beet farming in Alberta. But at least they were guaranteed to be together. Now in the Langham Centre, there are many pictures displayed from internment years, and I was really delighted. I found this picture of my Aunt Michi working as a medical assistant in the clinic in Kaslo, second from the left. I also took this picture of some people on a baseball team. And it was only after I showed it to my mother that we realized that my father is in there. And you can see he's the second person to the left of those in uniform, people from the famous Asahi baseball team. I mentioned before that my father was sent to a work camp in Ontario, so you might wonder why he's in this picture in Kaslo, which brings me to another story, which still has many loose ends to it. While in Kaslo, my grandfather Kai was taken ill and was in the Kaslo hospital for several months. It didn't seem that anyone was really completely sure what his ailment was. I've been told that he had kidney problems, but I've also been told that he had some kind of blood poisoning. Now, my father and his brothers were working in Ontario. They made request to come and visit him. Here's a letter which was sent back to them. Again, hard to read, but it does say that since their father's condition had not changed, the request was being denied. The letter's dated October 6th, 1942. Yusuke Kai died in Kaslo less than 2 weeks after that, at the age of 52. My father showed up in Kaslo a few days later, and to this day no one is sure how he got there. Apparently he left his work camp without permission after hearing of his father's death. Somehow he made his way across the country. Once in Kaslo, he stayed in hiding to avoid arrest and could not even attend his father's funeral. Eventually things somehow got worked out, and he was allowed to stay in Kaslo, as he was now the oldest male in the family. He had broken the rules, but it seems that the rules got bent a little bit, and that compassion won out in the end. The details are very sketchy because my father never spoke about this incident to anyone, not even my mother. In fact, I never once heard him speak of anything that happened to him during the wartime years. Now, it's a sad part of our family history, but I want to say that there are also good things that happened in Kaslo. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like to have been a resident of Kaslo, before 1942. Imagine being told that 1,000 so-called enemy aliens were going to be moving into your town, basically doubling the population. And yet the CJs moving into Kaslo were met with at least tolerance and often with friendship. And government workers and RCMP also treated the internees with respect, even though they were being required to enforce unjust laws. St. Andrew's United Church in Kaslo opened its doors to the new arrivals and welcomed them. And here's a few pictures of the church, the interior there. And in the church there is a historic plaque to commemorate how the church was a friend to the Japanese Canadians in Kaslo. Now soon the church was bustling with a big Sunday school. And here's some pictures of the classes. My mother was one of the teachers, but the teacher here in this picture is Aya Higashi, a lifelong friend of my mother's, and I'll say more about her in a few minutes. Many of the Sunday school teachers who are high school graduates were recruited to become elementary school teachers. Since no provision had been made for the education of children, the CJs took it on themselves to organize them. The teachers were trained quickly by Hide Hyodo. At one time, only one of 2 certified CJ teachers in the province. He's seen there at the bottom right. In Kaslo, this abandoned store was used as the school. So that's a picture in the early 40s. That's what it looks like today. Among the teachers were my mother, Sumi Matsugu, here seen in the middle, and also, as I mentioned before, Aya Higashi, who we managed to see while we were in Kaslo. And she's lived there ever since. CJ high school students were told that they could complete their education by correspondence if they wished. However, in Kaslo, the principal, Russ MacArthur, bent the rules and allowed the internees to attend high school there, which enabled some of them to later go on to university. So it's another bending of the rules in Kaslo. And after the war, all CJs were supposed to leave Kaslo and resettle east of the Rockies. Either that or face deportation to Japan. However, Aya's mother was still in the Kaslo sanatorium and could not be moved, so Aya was allowed to stay. She's lived on in Kaslo ever since, and has had a long career as a teacher and is a beloved member of the community. Our gospel reading today was about the transfiguration of Jesus. And on the mountain, things changed. Everything changed. Everything became more holy. The disciples had a different experience of who Jesus was. They recognized his holiness in a new way. And I would say that in Kaslo, a transfiguration of sorts also happened. People who once saw each other as enemies saw that not only are we one in Christ, but we are really only one human family. And as well, the people of the United Churches in these mountain camps and towns, they found their faith tempered in the crucible of the wartime years. Within the United Church, CJs found a safe place, and they created loving communities that continued long after they were dispersed. And they became the foundation of Japanese Canadian churches in major centers across Canada. And so the mountains became a holy place, a place where faith grew and blossomed in spite of, and perhaps in part due to, the troubled times the internees went through. As I wrote in the hymn, "Our God goes with us. In lonely mountain paths, our God was found. Faith, hope, and love, making ghost towns holy ground." I cannot overemphasize the vital role that the United Church, especially at the General Council level, played in aiding the CJ community before and after and during the war. The United Church was and has always been a steady friend and ally of the Japanese Canadian people. Reverend Kosaburo Shimizu was based in Kaslo, but he ended up caring for internees throughout the camps, and after the war for internees who were then dispersed across Canada. The United Church sent missionaries who had returned from Japan to help the internees, people such as Constance Chappell and Netta Sadler. And later, as CJs left the ghost towns and camps, the United Church deaconesses and ministers assisted them to find housing, employment, and church connections in new cities. When after the war the government proposed the wholesale deportation / exile of CJs to Japan, the United Church was one of the strong opposing voices. And when it became obvious that most CJs could not feel comfortable in their local, mostly Anglo-Saxon churches, it supported the formation of Japanese United Churches. I know that the CJ community as a whole is grateful to the United Church of Canada and its commitment to justice. And so am I, as one who was raised in the Centennial Japanese United Church congregation in Toronto, that you see pictured here. I'd even venture to say that we are fiercely proud of our United Church heritage. The Ghost Town Tour helped me to understand how much I have been shaped by the experiences that my parents and my community endured. I think it's helped me to understand a few things. Why witnessing acts of prejudice and racism bother me so much. Why I and so many other CJs identified so strongly with the civil rights movement in the U.S. in the 1960s. And why my parents taught me to never, ever, ever judge another person by outward appearances. And fourth, why I love United Church of Canada. The Ghost Town Tour helped me to see all of this, to see where I've come from, and why I am the person I am today. And for this, I am truly thankful.